Hey everybody, this is Steve Warren, and in this video I want to do a deep dive of how you can use the Power BI PowerShell commandlets and integrate those into Azure Functions so that you could run those in an automated fashion. I had a customer reach out to me who said that they were currently using the Power BI PowerShell commandlets, but they were manually running these on their machine. They wanted to know how they could automate that so that they didn't have to manually run those. So this video is going to be a deep dive of how you can do exactly that. There's a number of different things. And what I've done here in this video, which is a little bit different than what I've done previously, is I'm actually going to show you systematically how I put this together. And there were some things I learned along the way, and I wanted to share those with you. So we're going to start out by just using Power BI with the PowerShell commandlets locally. We're then going to introduce how you can authenticate as a service principal. And then we're going to show how you can then take that PowerShell script, put that into Azure Functions. And then we're going to finish it up with actually showing what are some things that you would want to do to actually clean up that script. So I'll show you different authentication options, how you can authenticate with an application secret, how you can authenticate with a client certificate, and then how you can use environment variables to actually make this better to be able to deploy so that you're not potentially putting secrets into source code if you're checking this PowerShell script into source code. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please, if you have any questions or comments, please put them in the comments below. I'll also make sure to put some notes on GitHub in the description for this video as well. So the first thing we're going to do here is we're going to create an Azure Active Directory application to be the service principal that's going to authenticate with Power BI. So we're in Azure. We're going to go into Azure Active Directory. And here we want to now create an Azure Active Directory application. So we're going to go ahead and give this a name. We'll call this Power BI PowerShell client. For the redirect URL, we're not going to put anything there. And now what we want to do is we want to just keep track of a couple pieces of information. We want to copy the application ID. We'll take the tenant ID. And then we also want to now create a secret. So this is the way that you authenticate as the service principal for Azure Active Directory for the application. And you can do this one of two ways. You can either use a client secret, which is just a shared secret. So it's a long string. That's the secret that proves that you are who you say you are. Or you can create your own self-signed certificate or a cert that's issued from your own certificate store and authenticate that way. We're going to use the app secret approach here, but no, you could do either with this approach with PowerShell, and I'll try to point that out later. And when you create this, it's really important. You only get the value the first time you create this. If you go back, you won't be able to get the value. So make sure you copy that after you create your secret. And let's go ahead and just paste this in here. And now we've got all the information we need from a PowerShell perspective. Now, the next thing we're going to do here is we're going to create a security group that we're going to put that identity into. So from a Power BI administration perspective, it's recommended that you create a security group to then add that group to be allowed to run commands as a service principal. So let's go over to Active Directory groups, create a new group, and we'll call this Power BI Service Principal. And the current admin I'm logged in as, I will add that as the owner, and the member, we're going to add the Azure Active Directory application. Now we do need the app ID for that, so I'm going to copy that right here. I'm going to paste that. There we go, Power BI PowerShell client. We'll select that and we'll create. So now we just created our group and we added the Azure Active Directory application to that group. Let's now switch over to Power BI, the admin portal, and see how we can get this configured. We'll see two settings we're going to play with, developer settings. One is allow service principals to use Power BI APIs. So we'll go ahead and enable that, and we'll do it for specific security groups. In this case, we did Power BI service principal role. There we go. We'll go ahead and apply that. We're also going to enable this other one that allows service principals to use read-only Power BI admin APIs. So let's go ahead and enable this. Once again, we'll do the same security group, Power BI service principal role. Here's the documentation on the preview of enabling service principal authentication for read-only APIs. If you go to the bottom, you can actually see what are the API calls that are supported. And in this example, we're going to be using effectively the get groups as admin via PowerShell. Okay, so now we're looking at PowerShell, and we're going to run the PowerShell commandlets for Power BI using the Azure Active Directory application we just created and the settings we just enabled in the portal to allow service principals to authenticate and to also allow service principals to now use some of the read-only APIs from the Power BI service. So first thing we're going to do here is I want to show you the module you need installed on your PowerShell client. So we're going to do a search here on what are the installed modules I already have. And so we'll see that there's the series of Microsoft Power BI MGMT. That is the module you want to install. Make sure that's installed. Make sure you have the latest version of that before you go ahead and move forward with what I'm about to show you. The next thing we're going to do here is with the module, we want to sign in. We don't want to sign in as a user. We want to sign in as a service account. So if you were to see this commandlet, login -Power BI, that's what you would use if you were just logging in as a regular user and using the identity of your own Office 365 account against the Power BI APIs. But we want to do this slightly differently. We want to connect as a service account. So let's go ahead and actually do connect-Power BI service account. And the other thing we're going to specify is that we want this to be a service principal. And we also need to specify what the tenant is. So once again, we copied that previously. So let me go ahead and grab that. And the last thing we need are the credentials. So this would be the app ID and the app secret that we initially created when we created the AAD application. You can do this a number of ways. I want to show you the manual way first, and then I'll show you how you could automate this if this were scripted. So we're going to do -credential, and then we're going to pass it a getCredential object. So when we run this, I'm now going to get prompted for username and password. The username in this case is going to be the AAD application ID. So we'll go ahead and copy that. And the password is just going to be that secret that we copied when we initially created the application. So we'll go ahead and paste that. And now we're in. And so now we can actually run some of the admin APIs that are read-only against the Power BI tenant as this service principal identity, which is pretty cool. So for example, if I wanted to enumerate what are all the workspaces in my Power BI tenant, we can go ahead and do that now under this identity. So let's go ahead and try that. So I'll do a get-Power BI group, and I'm going to specify -scope as organization. This is effectively going to get all of the groups as an admin. So we go ahead and run this. And now we'll see the workspaces that are in this tenant. This is a brand new tenant I just created with Steve's test workspace. And so there's not a whole lot going in here, but we see Steve's test workspace. We also see a personal workspace for the admin account. And then we also see a personal workspace for the AAD application account as well. The other thing I wanted to show is that what I showed so far was using an AAD application secret to authenticate as the service principal with the application. But if you wanted to use a certificate, you would use a slightly different syntax in the PowerShell. So let me just show that real quick. You would do connect-Power BI service account. We're still going to specify a service principal. We would specify the tenant here. I'm going to skip that for right now. We would then specify the application ID as a command line argument. And then the next thing we would do is we would pass whatever the thumbprint is of the certificate that's installed on your machine. And that's how you would use certificate authentication versus application secret authentication. And the last thing I wanted to mention is that if you're in one of our sovereign clouds, you do have to put a switch on the commandlet to tell it that you're in one of these sovereign clouds. So if we go back to connect-Power BI service account, there is an environment flag here, and you can specify whatever your sovereign cloud is. So you just want to make sure if you're, for example, in GCC High, that you're doing the US Gov High switch for the environment there. So now let's say that you want to get this ready to script this, so you want this to run in some kind of automated fashion, and you want to be able to pump in the application secret instead of having to manually prompt that every single time. I'm going to show you how you could do that. This is going to be hard-coded with the secret as just plain text, but you could also set this up where you're getting this from, say, Azure Key Vault as well. So the first thing that we have to do here is we have to actually get the password, in this case, the application secret, convert it into a secure string. So this is how we would do that with PowerShell. We're going to save this as a password variable. And then the next thing that we're going to do here is we're actually going to create a credential object. Okay, so here's the syntax to do that. We're actually creating a new credential object here where the user ID is the application ID, and then the password is that secure string that we just created in the previous line. Okay, so let's go ahead and now run the commandlet. So we're going to do connect-Power BI service account. We're We're going to do -tenant, and let's go ahead. I'll copy the tenant ID. I'm also going to tell it that it is a service principal identity. And the cool thing here now is we can give it the credential, and we're just going to use the password or the variable that we just created previously, and we're going to pass that into the command line. And we can see there that we just successfully now logged in without having to manually put the application ID and the app secret there. So once again, the setup that we would want to get to from an automation perspective is we would store the app secret in something like Key Vault, securely get that value, convert that to a secure string, then we could pump that into the connect-Power BI service account commandlet. And so here is a script that I just put together, putting all this together where we're storing the app ID, the tenant ID, and the secret. Once again, probably a best practice to put the secret in something like Key Vault instead of just in plain text. But then from there, we can create the credential object, and then we can pass that to the connect-Power BI service account. And the last thing we'll do here is we'll just then list all of the workspaces in the tenant. So let's go ahead and do a get-Power BI group, and we'll say -scope organization. So let's go ahead and run that and see what happens. So we can see that we logged in successfully, and then we also then get the workspaces outputted into the prompt. All right, so let's go ahead and create a Azure Function resource and then use that PowerShell script to run that in Azure. So I'm going to search for a function app, go ahead and create. I'm going to create this in a new resource group. So we'll give it a name. For the runtime stack, we're going to choose PowerShell, and we'll go ahead and create this. Okay, so it looks like that was created successfully. So the next thing we need to do is we do need to set up a dependency for this Azure function. So if you remember, the one thing we need is we do need the Power BI management module for this PowerShell script to work correctly. So let's go ahead and configure that first. So we're going to go to the advanced tools here. And now we're going to run a PowerShell debug console. And we're actually going to go into the files for this function app. I'm going to go into www-root. And the requirements.psd1 file is where we want to specify that this Power BI module is required. So we're going to click on the little pencil to edit this. And we can see that the Azure module is required for 5 or higher. We're going to go ahead and add one more. Okay, so we just added the Microsoft Power BI management module. We're saying that it just has to be the major version 1, but any of the minor versions are fine. We'll go ahead and save this. Then we're going to go back to the function app, and we do want to restart the function app now. And now the next thing we're going to do is let's go ahead and actually create our first function with the PowerShell script in there. So we're going to go to functions, say add. And really, this trigger could be anything. It could be a timer in the sense that it runs every day or every week. We're going to make it an HTTP trigger just because it's easier to test that way. So we'll go ahead and say HTTP trigger. We'll give it a name. We'll call it get Power BI groups. And we'll say add. Now we're going to go to the code section. And this will provide kind of a quick little snippet of our first Azure function with PowerShell. We're going to replace this with our own logic here. The other thing is the first time this runs, because we did add a dependency for the Power BI module, this function will take quite a while to run the very first time. So let me go ahead and actually paste in the script that we're going to put in here. And actually, before I put the script in here, I want to go back to this other section, integration. So what this is going to show is how does this Azure function start? So it's going to start from a trigger, which is an HTTP request. We'll then run the function that we're about to define. We'll then have output, which would be the response to the HTTP request. But we can also add another output here for example, blob storage. So let's say in this case, we want to get all of the Power BI groups, and then we want to write that to a blob file in Azure. So we can add a new output here. And we're going to choose blob storage. We'll give it the output parameter name of output blob. The path is going to be out container / some random GUID. And then let's go ahead and just add .json because we'll spit out JSON to that. So that's what the file will look like. And then we'll go ahead and say that'll be in the Azure Web Job storage account that got created for this Azure function. We can say OK. And now we're going to go back to code and test. And I'm going to update this script that was provided as a shell with the actual logic for the Power BI. Okay, So this is the updated logic from that script that I had on my desktop originally. We can see that we're specifying app ID, tenant ID, and secret. Once again, there are better ways to get the secret, but I'm just putting that in plain text for right now. Then we're going to go ahead and connect as the service account. We'll then enumerate all of the workspaces in the Power BI tenant. And then we're going to have two different outputs here. One is going to output to the HTTP response, which is what this action here is. Push-output binding is your commandlet to send data back to whatever the output bindings are for an Azure function. But we can have multiple. So in this case, we have another push-output binding to our output blob, which we just configured so that we can now take that raw JSON file and create a file inside of Azure Blob storage. So we'll go ahead and save this, and then we'll do a test run. Now, once again, this first test run probably will take quite a bit of time because we see here we actually get a warning that the managed dependency download is in progress. So just know that the first time you try this, it may time out, it may fail, but really you need to wait for the dependency, in this case, the Power BI module, to get installed in the function. So we'll let this do its thing, and then we'll test this again one more time. So if we look at the response for that first execution, we do see that we got a 503 service unavailable, pretty much this timed out. So let's go ahead and just try to test it one more time. Okay, so after waiting a few minutes, we were able to get a successful response. We can see that the HTTP response content was the JSON representation of the groups in the Power BI tenant. And then the other thing we can do is we can go to the blob storage and see what that looks like. So let's check that out real quick. So what we'll see here is that there's now a new container called out container. And we'll actually see that there are two files created here because I actually ran this twice. Let's go ahead and just open one of these up. And there we go. We actually have the JSON file that was saved to Azure Blob storage with all the information of the Power BI workspaces that we queried from PowerShell. So now I want to take a look at how would we get these values that are hard-coded actually populated from something that's not. And so I alluded to earlier, it'd be really good if we could take this secret and not have this just hard-coded in plain text. So what I want to show you now is how you can actually use Azure Function application secrets to then pump these into environment variables so they're available to the script. But the benefit here is that we're not going to have these values hard-coded anymore. So let's go ahead and take a look at how we can do that. We're going to go back to the Azure function. We're going to go to configuration. And then what we're going to do is we're actually going to add a few new application settings that are going to have the app ID, the app secret, and the tenant ID. So let's go ahead and do that. So I just added 3 new application settings: app ID, app secret, and app tenant ID. I saved that. The next thing you have to do is you do have to go back to the function itself and restart the function so that the PowerShell function now has access to these new environment variables that are now going to be exposed. So that just got restarted. So we'll go back to the function. And the last step we're going to do is we're actually just going to change the code to, instead of having it being hard-coded, to now use the environment variables. Okay, so what I just did is I replaced the hard-coded values with now picking up from environment variables, and you'll see the convention is $env : whatever the name is that you configured in your application settings. So now that's saved, let's go ahead and test this to make sure it still runs the same way as it did before. And we can see that we got a response of a 200 response back. It ran exactly the same as it did before. But once again, there's the nice benefit. We no longer have the values hard-coded in our file. The benefit here is that if we put this into source code, we wouldn't have a secret that we're now checking into source code. And the other benefit here is that if we had like different environments like development, production, etc., we could easily swap that out with the application settings with how it's set up with the Azure function. And the last thing I wanted to take a look at is when you're authenticating as a service principal with the Power BI PowerShell commandlets, you have 2 ways to do that. One is with an app secret, which we've done all the way up until this point. The other option is you can actually authenticate with a client certificate. And so I wanted to show you how that route would look. Now, the first thing you need to do is you need to go back to the Azure application, and you need to go into certificates and secrets. And then you need to upload a secret. So you do need to create a secret ahead of time. You can either create a self-signed certificate, or you can create a certificate that is from one of your trusted certificate authorities. I just created a self-signed certificate. I then exported that as a public certificate file, and I'm going to upload that here. So we can see here I've got the function cert.cer file. We'll go ahead and add that. And now what this does is this actually registers this certificate as a certificate that can authenticate to Azure Active Directory as this application. Step 2 is now we need to actually get that certificate installed in our Azure Function application. So we're going to go back to our Azure Function. We're going to go to TLS and SSL settings. And we're going to go to private key certificates, and we're now going to upload a certificate here. So this time around, what we need to do is we actually need to upload not just the public file of the certificate, which has the public key, but we need to include a key that has the private key as well. So we're going to go ahead and upload a certificate, and I'm uploading my function cert.pfx. pfx has the private key, and there's a password associated with that. And now we have the certificate now uploaded to the Azure Function. The other thing I'm going to do here is that we no longer need the app secret in the app settings. Instead of an app secret, what we want to store now is the client certificate thumbprint that we're going to be using. That's the one that we just installed in our Azure Function. So I'm going to go ahead and delete the app secret, application secret, and we're going to add a new one, and we'll call this client cert, and we'll give it a value, which is going to be the thumbprint of the certificate that we're using here. We'll save that. After you actually upload the client certificate, you need to add another setting in the application setting for the Azure Function to tell it to load the specific certificate once the process starts. So let's go ahead and do that. And the name is website_load_certificates. And then we just have to give it the client certificate thumbprint. If you had multiple, I believe they just have to be comma separated. We'll say OK. We'll say save. As always, I'll restart the app. And now here we go. I've got the script. Notice I updated this to now use the client certificate and the application ID in the commandlet, whereas before we were doing a get credential and hard coding what the app ID and the app secret was. So let's go ahead and run this just to make sure this runs the same as the other ones did before. Beautiful. We got an HTTP 200 response back. Everything worked as expected. And this is the last example I was going to show you just so that you kind of have some options. Whatever your requirements are, you can decide whether you want to use the app secret authentication approach or generate your own certificate and use a client certificate authentication. So thank you all for taking the time to watch this video. This video was a lot longer than most of my other videos in the past. I hope you appreciate the format of me kind of systematically and iteratively kind of building on one step at a time. I'd love to hear your feedback. If you have any questions or comments on this, please put them in the comments below. And until next time, thank you for watching my video.